Right, very, very special guest speaker today, all the way from Brighton. Welcome, Jim. I shall allow you, I assume you'll introduce yourself as much as you wish in the talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be here. Good to see so many people in the MRL who will remember Chris sitting on a cardboard box writing code because there were no chairs. So yeah, it's good to be back. So I am Jim Peverick, and I used to do research at the MRL about 20 years ago. And since then, I have been doing, let's see if I can get it to go to another slide. I've been working on a bunch of virtual worlds. So for the last pretty much 20 years, with a little break in the middle, I've been working on virtual worlds and VR stuff. The first chunk of that time was working as a software engineer on things like Dragon Empires, Warhammer Online, Second Life, and EVE Online. And those were mostly virtual worlds which were large scale, persistent, but accessed via a desktop computer. So desktop VR, as some people used to call it. But the thing that was interesting about those worlds is that they were big and they had lots of people who could interact with each other in interesting ways, including kind of whacking each other around the head, but also interacting via economies in the virtual world and stuff like that. So those tended to have, the innovation was not so much in the interface, the innovation was in the stuff that was happening in the world. Lots of stuff was happening, and the things that happened continued to happen even if you weren't there, and lots of interesting things happened as a result. And then the second phase, so then I thought I was done with it. The short version of that is that World of Warcraft came along and was better than all of the other virtual worlds, and so everybody packed up their toys and stopped trying to make virtual worlds anymore because World of Warcraft was the best one. So that kind of ended that period of massively multiplayer online games. I went to work at Facebook, but then shortly after I started working at Facebook, they acquired Oculus, and the whole VR circus started all over again. And so when I was at Oculus, it was much more about the interface, because that's what Oculus were doing. They were building VR headsets. But Facebook at the time were obviously very interested in using their VR hardware to build social experiences for people to connect with each other. And so my team in London, I was the engineering lead for a team in London who built and shipped Oculus Rims, which was a small social experience for you and your friends to meet. And that ran insanely on a telephone strapped to your face. And then we worked on Oculus Venues, which also worked on a telephone strapped to your face. And the idea behind that was, okay, so one of the problems with Oculus Rims was that you might have lots of friends, but the chances of you and your friend both being in a VR headset at the same time and wanting to hang out together were quite low. And so unless you kind of organized sessions to meet up together, it was quite difficult to just serendipitously bump into some stuff that was happening. And if you didn't have friends that had VR headsets, then you were kind of a bit stuck for hanging out in Oculus Rims with anybody. So Oculus Venues, the idea was, okay, well, if we run events and we open it up to the public, then whenever there's an event, you can go to the event in your VR headset and you can have a fun social experience with other people, experiencing maybe the World Cup or some other sports event or some comedy or a film. But there will be some reason for you to go into VR at some particular time to experience the thing that was happening, the event that was happening. And then the final thing I worked on relatively recently was Horizon Workrooms, and that was exploring, okay, well, can we use these social spaces for people who are working potentially at home during a pandemic when they can't come into the office together? And so Horizon Workrooms looks quite a lot like Oculus Rims, but for work. The big innovations there were much more around haptics. And so one of the things we wanted to allow people to do was bring their PC into VR so they could do things like this, have a meeting where they had a laptop that was presenting on a screen, but they had a bunch of people in VR together. And the other thing that we wanted to be able to do is make it possible for people to do things like type on the keyboard that they brought into VR, so that you could take notes and do stuff. And so probably the thing that was most interesting to me about that project was that we took real objects and we mapped them to virtual objects. So if you had a desk in the real world, we would go, okay, where we'll map that desk in the real world to the desk in the virtual world. So now you can lean on the desk in the virtual world. And now you can put a cup of coffee down on the virtual desk without it falling on your shoes and spilling coffee all over your feet. So that was the interesting thing there. And then I've continued to work on VR stuff. I'm currently an advisor for a startup called Vertex, who are building virtual stadiums for esports. So that's what I've been up to over the last 20-ish years. Things I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a social scientist. However, I will talk about things that touch on law and social science in this talk. If I get it wrong, that's because I'm not qualified, and many of you may know more than me about some of these areas. But I wanted to talk today more about things like law and governance and society and community in VR than about technology, because at the MRL we had virtual worlds, but they didn't tend to last very long, so they didn't tend to change and evolve much over time. We also had people in those virtual worlds, but there didn't tend to be many of them, not enough to maybe warrant having a government or a system of law and governance and so on. But as you get big virtual worlds, you end up, these problems become actual problems that you need to deal with. So that's what I wanted to talk about, because it's the sort of thing that maybe is somewhat novel to this audience, but things that I've been kind of dealing with for the last 20 years. So in particular, I want to talk about a book called My Tiny Life. This is a book that I recommended to absolutely everyone I met at Oculus. So when people joined Oculus, they were given a copy of Ready Player One, which is a piece of science fiction in the sort of suggestion that this is what we're going to build together. And so when they got their copy of Ready Player One, I suggested that they also pair it with a book called My Tiny Life, which is a book about an actual virtual world and the things that happened in it. It was written in the 90s about a text-based virtual world called Lambda. And it's, I think, the best piece of non-fiction to read if you are thinking about getting involved in crazy endeavors like trying to build a metaverse. So in particular, I'm going to talk about the first chapter of that book, which is an article which was published in the Village Voice in 1993, so nearly 30 years ago now. It's called A Rape in Cyberspace, and this forms the first chapter of My Tiny Life. So it's about an incident that happened in Lambda, which is a user-generated text-based virtual world. And what happened was a character, an avatar, a person in that virtual world called Mr. Bungle makes puppet copies of other people in the living room of that environment while they're present in that environment. And he makes those avatars do violent sexual things to each other against the wishes of the people who were actually those avatars being copied. And so this was a huge, big deal inside this virtual world. It also became a relatively huge, big deal in the real world because people were asking questions like, is this really a crime, right? If people are in a virtual world and they are hurtful to each other, do people actually get hurt? Is this actually a crime? Is this a game, or is this a real thing that's going on? This was 30 years ago. Now it's pretty clear that this is a crime, right? People were actually hurt, even though it was their avatars that were being interacted with in the virtual world. People were upset, people were offended, people felt abused, and they felt that they had been done wrong to. And so the other thing that came about was this a real community, right? So at the time, people called MUDs and Tinies, tiny worlds, right? They were like, oh, is this a doll's house? Are we just playing with things here? Is this a toy? And as a result of this incident, Lambda very definitely turned from something that was just a neat thing that people played with to, no, this is a community and there are rules and there are laws and there are consequences and there is governance, and that we're gonna work this out. So things that got discussed. So this incident happened. Afterwards, there was a big meeting inside the virtual world where people talked about what had happened and what the consequences should be for this. And then what ended up happening is one of the administrators of the virtual world terminated the account of the perpetrator. And in some ways that solved the problem. In other ways, that raised more problems, which is like, wait a minute, how do you get, do you get to, as someone who administers this virtual world, just unilaterally decide what the punishment is going to be and get to carry it out? And so after that meeting and after that punishment was carried out, there was then further discussion that talked about, okay, well, who decides, right? Is it okay for you, because you happen to have the administrative password, to decide what crime and punishment should be in this virtual world, or should everybody else decide? And after this event happened, Pavel Kurtis, I think, who's the person who built Landamu, implemented a bunch of systems inside Landamu where people could vote for, set up petitions and vote for anything that required administrative access to carry out. And so effectively what happened is that the decisions that were made in terms of the crimes and the punishment that would be carried out inside this virtual world were decided by the people in the virtual world, right? So this single incident effectively turned the virtual world from a plaything that somebody made and that other people were playing around with into a virtual community that was, in some senses, a democracy and decided its own crime and punishment. And this all happened relatively quickly. This also happened 30 years ago. But the reason we're still talking about it is because people are still learning these lessons the hard way with graphical virtual worlds right now, which is partly why I'm talking about it. I think it's interesting to this audience, but also the reason I'm still talking about it is because people are still not learning these lessons, and people are building virtual worlds that don't have suitable mechanisms in place to try and avoid these things happening in the future, and they should be. So if we're building a virtual world now, what do we need to think about to avoid this being a problem in our brand new virtual world that we're considering? Well, the first thing that people think about is, okay, well, we can filter out the offensive parts, right? We're building a virtual world. We are not constrained by the laws of physics. We can do all sorts of crazy stuff. We're magicians. We can fix this, right? We don't have to deal with the same sorts of problems that the real world has. And so what people often do is go, okay, well, we can, if someone's being offensive to you, if someone's doing something abusive, someone's doing something that you don't like, you can just mute them. You can block them. You can like have the view that you used to have of the virtual world minus the bits that you don't like. Everything's great, right? We're done. Well, maybe not. Because first of all, subjectivity in virtual worlds gets really confusing. I mean, virtual worlds are just confusing anyway, right? I mean, we've all spent hours and hours in virtual worlds going, can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you hear me? Can you see me? Right? That's still a thing, unfortunately, now. But if you then go and build in mechanisms into that virtual world that mean that I can go into a virtual world with a friend, find somebody offensive, mute that person so that I can't hear them, but my friend can still hear them, I'm now in this weird three-way conversation where my friend can hear things that I can't hear. I can hear things my friend's hearing. It rapidly gets very confusing. And also, there's still the problem of the initial offense, right? So if I have this button that says turn off the offensive thing, presumably there is still some period of time where I see the offensive thing before I decide it's offensive and turn it off. And isn't that a problem? And isn't that more of a problem if the person who is subject to this abuse or who finds this behavior offensive spends a bunch of time trying to find the tools, right? They're just new to this virtual world. You're effectively saying, you can make this virtual world fine for yourself. Here are some tools to do it. You're welcome. See you later. But actually, that is often not enough, especially when it's new people to the virtual world who don't know what they're doing, who are being bullied or abused or whatever, expecting them to be able to hunt through an interface, find the tools, do the thing, is a lot to ask people to do. There's also the problem that even if you mute all that stuff, it may continue, right? So if something offensive is happening to me and I mute it out of my view of the virtual world, it may still be in the view of the virtual world of the person who's doing that action, that offensive action. And they might also be sharing it via other channels, right? If I'm in a virtual world and I turn off something that I find horrible, and then the next day I see a video of that plus an extra half an hour happening on YouTube, then that also doesn't necessarily solve the problem. So filtering is part of the solution, but I don't think it's all of the solution. Another interesting thing to think about is if you can filter by default. There are, in graphical virtual worlds, you find that people will nearly always keep a safe social distance from each other because people are just used to doing that, right? If you're standing around in a circle talking to people, everyone will keep, a respectful distance from each other if that's what they're trying to do. And so if people get closer to other people, they're probably doing it by accident because they don't know how to navigate yet, and that happens a lot. Or they're doing it because they're intentionally trying to get too close to somebody, get uncomfortably close to somebody. So you can do things like saying, okay, in our virtual world, if two avatars get too close to each other, we'll fade them out so they can't see each other, right? So there's absolutely no chance that the two avatars can get close enough for one avatar to virtually grope the other one, because as soon as they get too close for that to happen, then they'll fade out. So that's something potentially you can do. It is tempting to go one step further and say, okay, well, why don't we just make it impossible for two avatars to get too close together, right? And we won't fade them out. We'll just stop them getting too close together. We'll make them bounce off each other. The problem with that approach is that you can then get gangs of bad actors who can then run around in your virtual world, and they can form a ring around the person they want to bully. And now you've made the situation worse because the person being bullied can't get out, because as soon as they try and get out of that ring, they bounce into one of the people who's making their life miserable. So you have got to be careful with this stuff. You can do some amount of filtering, but it's probably not enough. Ultimately, you probably need to exclude offenders, which is what happened in LambdaMoo, and it is kind of best. It tends to happen in virtual worlds who are taking this problem seriously. Ultimately, you want to kick people out of the virtual world who are causing problems. You need to say this is not okay. If that's how you're going to behave, you're not going to be allowed inside this virtual world. But that raises a bunch more questions, like who has the power to kick people out? How do we avoid accidentally giving bad actors power over other people, right? So if we're giving people the power to kick other people out of the virtual world, that's going to be very attractive to someone who wants to cause mayhem in the virtual world. They would love to have those powers and then be able to run around kicking people out of the virtual world. So you have to be careful about that. Another interesting question is whether you can report other people. So earlier on, one of the problems that you have to deal with is that you get new people joining the virtual world and immediately getting jumped on by other people. If you allow more tenured, more experienced people in the virtual world to report people on the behalf of people that they see being bullied, then you can then potentially allow a situation where the good actors can help solve this problem by being able to use the tools that maybe other people can't, and using them on their behalf. So can you do that? That's another thing. Another question is how quickly decisions need to be made. So in the case of Oculus venues, Oculus already had a system for reporting bad behavior and it being reviewed and acted on, but the timeline for that process was in some cases days. And if you're screening the World Cup final and you've got hundreds of people watching the World Cup final and you've got one bad actor who's running around causing mayhem for 2 hours, and then you exclude them 3 days later, then a lot of harm has already been done. So when you're thinking about what kind of events or what kind of virtual world you're building and how it works, you need to think about how quickly do I need to make these decisions, and that may be changed by whether you're a virtual world that just continues indefinitely forever, or whether it's a virtual world that kind of gets turned on, shows the World Cup, and then gets turned off again. Another question is how do we stop people coming back, which is really hard, right? So if you're letting anybody into your virtual world and it's really easy to make an account, and people don't care about the account that they have, they're just turning up to cause mayhem, then it can be really easy for you to kick somebody out and then for them to immediately create a new account and come back in again. And so some ways of dealing with that are things like tying identities to IP addresses, has been done before, tying identities to VR headset hardware potentially, although that can also get shared, tying it to Facebook accounts, which are harder to recycle than maybe other accounts. And then you need to think about, like, again, as we talked about before, who's making the decisions, how can I appeal the decisions, all that kind of stuff. So as you can see from the last couple of slides, this is a lot of work. It is very tempting for tech companies to take things that are a lot of work and worry about them later. So, one of the phrases you'll hear often is that, like, hey, this is a nice problem to have. If our virtual world is popular enough that people want to turn up and cause mayhem in it, maybe we've got a successful virtual world and maybe we can deal with it at that point. The problem with that is that what you're trying to do with these rules and systems is to establish norms. And so you want to tell people what the rules are, you want to show people what the rules are, you want to show people there are consequences to their actions, and hopefully that will build kind of strong, positive social norms in your virtual world, where people know that they're not allowed to and not expected to behave badly, and therefore will hopefully behave well. If you wait until everyone is behaving badly, it is incredibly difficult to turn that community round, right? If you turn up to a virtual world and everyone's behaving badly, then the people who don't want to behave badly or don't want to put up with people behaving badly will just leave. And the people you'll be left with are the people who are quite up for behaving badly and causing mayhem. And so then you're creating a negative feedback loop by not dealing with that problem at the start. Whereas if you do deal with that problem at the start, if you, instead of punting this problem down the line, you deal with it before you launch, then you have a much better chance of being able to tell people what the rules are, be able to show people there are consequences to their actions, and hopefully build a positive community from the start, instead of allowing it to become a toxic environment and then trying to deal with that later, which is much, much harder. And you can also use good actors can be empowered to help other people, right? So one of the things you can do is identify people who are more tenured, identify people who have a reputation, and then allow them to help in helping other people join the virtual world. So in things like in lots of virtual worlds, you can be greeted by other people in the virtual world. It's a much better idea to have people greet people, having people you trust greet those new people, rather than having other new people meet those new people, because the other new people might be people who are just sitting there recycling accounts so that they can jump into the virtual world and cause some mayhem again. So it's not something you can push down the line. So it's a lot of work. You have to do it up front. Why are we even bothering with this? This all seems like a lot of work. Well, so first of all, and probably the most important point, is that you probably have a responsibility to keep people safe, right? We've known about this for 30 years. People are still deciding that they think it would be a great idea to build Ready Player One or build Snow Crash or build the Metaverse. If you are going to read Ready Player One and decide you're going to go and build the Metaverse, you should also probably read My Tiny Life, understand the lessons from it, and make sure that you keep people who you invite to your metaverse safe, right? That just seems like that's part and parcel of the responsibility. You can't go and make Ready Player One without also dealing with the problems that we've already learned about. And you should, because we shouldn't just keep relearning these lessons the hard way over and over again every time someone decides they're going to build a virtual world. And even though the virtual worlds we're building now are different, a lot of the lessons from the past are still applicable. And the alternative is kind of enforcing social bubbles, right? So when we built Oculus Rooms, we explicitly said, okay, you can only meet your friends to try and avoid a lot of these problems. I was only okay with us doing that on the basis that this was our first social experiment, and that down the line we were going to build virtual worlds that allowed strangers to meet together, because I didn't want to be in the business of building virtual worlds that were social and yet only let you meet the friends you already had, because I think the benefits are worth the costs. I think actually being able to meet strangers in virtual worlds is incredibly powerful. Some of my best friends I've met in virtual worlds and have known for years. I'm much more interested in making a more connected world than a world that enforces virtually the social bubbles that we see in real life. So ultimately, the TLDR of this is that the virtual worlds are virtual, the real people are real, the technology is changing, but the people are by and large staying the same. The way in which they behave is staying the same. We can learn the lessons from the virtual worlds of the past, even though we're building virtual worlds that might look very different now. So that part of the talk, and I realize I've been going on a bit. So up till now, this has felt like the talk has been all the things you should probably know if you're going to go and build a virtual world, right? If you get swept up in the current metaverse craze and decide you're going to go and build a metaverse or a virtual world or a part of a metaverse, then that's the stuff that you should probably know. You should read My Tiny Life. You should get your colleagues to read My Tiny Life. You should learn the lessons, and you should not have headlines saying, oh my God, somebody got abused in a virtual world that just got spun up, because it's been 30 years, we should learn the lessons now. Let's all grow up. So that's the developer talk part of it. But this isn't a developer conference, this is a lab talk. So let's think about the bigger picture. Let's think about what we can learn from this stuff. If we treat it as a feature, not a bug, right? If we treat the fact that we can change virtual worlds, we can build them out of software, we can change them, we can create them, we can destroy them, and we can, by and large, expect the people in them to behave like people behave in other communities, how can we use that to our advantage? What can we learn from it? This is a question that was asked a lot on the Terra Nova blog in the early 2000s. So it was a group of social scientists who were actual social scientists, although I did take part in this blog a little bit. And they would study societies in virtual worlds that were being spun up. And so the first big paper, the first bit of research that kind of led to this group blog was by Ted Castronova, who studied EverQuest as a real economy. He said, look, it's an economy, you can study it. I can look at the economy of Norath, which is EverQuest's virtual world, and I can tell you that the GDP per capita of Norath is above China and Russia, and somewhere between Russia and Bulgaria. And we can use the tools we've developed for studying real economies, and we can study virtual economies. And this is great because we have never before really had this situation where new economies have been pinging up left, right, and centre out of nowhere, right? These new worlds that we can study that are different in some ways to the real world, but similar in other ways, are really interesting. And Terra Nova became a group blog of a bunch of social scientists who all agreed with this and said, right, cool, let's study these virtual worlds. Then Larry Lessig came along, who went one step further, and actually he's a law professor, he ran for president, but he also got involved in the design of Second Life. He's one of the people who pushed for intellectual property rights for people in Second Life, which was super new at the time. His point was, if you were going to build a virtual world, if you were going to create a user-generated virtual world and you expected people to build stuff in it, you should let them own the stuff they build. Because if you do, then they're more likely to build stuff, they can then sell stuff, they can turn it into a business, right? This will create a real economy inside your virtual world, and you're much more likely to have much more of that economic activity going on than if you said, you can build stuff, but we own it all, which is the way things worked at the time. So since working on Second Life and running for president, Larry Lessig has also got involved in designing a virtual world called Seed, which is one where he wants to do much more of this experimentation of governance in virtual worlds, right? The idea with Seed is that it is a virtual world that includes economies and governance and politics and all of this kind of stuff, allows people to work together, form factions, interact with the virtual world and its ecology as well as its politics in lots of different ways. It's a pretty deep simulation of a virtual world. But one of the ideas here is that people can try out different ways of governing their communities inside the virtual world and find out which one's the best. And one of the things he hopes to happen is that from allowing people to learn about governance in virtual worlds, maybe they're going to learn more about governance in the real world, but maybe we're also going to learn things about better governing our real world by governing our virtual worlds. And this is a really interesting, powerful idea, I think, especially when you compare it to how we used to do political advancement, which is you write a book, you hope some people read it, maybe some of those people end up being revolutionaries or happen to find a country that they're in charge of, and they'll try out your political ideas, right? But if they go wrong, that's really bad. There are huge consequences. People find themselves trapped in failed states. It may be that the revolutionaries you were hoping were going to implement your political ideas actually turn out to be more interested in becoming dictators. Things can go wrong, right? So I think it's really interesting if we can get to the point where instead of over and over again learning how to keep people safe in virtual worlds, we get to the point where we can build virtual worlds that serve as political petri dishes or social super colliders, where we can build worlds to test political theories in the knowledge that the people in the virtual worlds are going to, in the main, behave in the same way that real people do. We can leverage the fact that the people are real. We can build worlds that are disposable, right? A lot of the talker in this area is assuming that this virtual world is going to last forever, and what we're trying to do is somehow bulletproof our metaverse against people who are trying to destroy it. But what happens if we say, well, no, it's okay? An okay outcome for the virtual world is that the people inside the virtual world destroy it. we get to the point where we go, okay, this experiment has failed, this hypothesis has failed, this state has failed. But instead of having real people trapped in a real failed state, we then go, okay, experiment over, thanks for everyone taking part, we turn off our virtual world. Maybe we restart it with different starting states. Maybe we iterate on our hypothesis and turn it back on again. We can repeat these experiments. We can run 10 of them in parallel and find out if the 10 of our states all ended up in the same way, or if they had different outcomes. We ran them in parallel. We can also run them at high speed, right? So we don't have to wait hundreds of years to figure out if this is a great way of governing our society. We can potentially run these simulations at super high speed, not use up much of the people's time who were involved in it, but still learn super valuable lessons about how politics may or may not work in the real world. I think this is really exciting because, Chris told me not to include this slide, arguably we need political advancement more urgently than we need technological advancement. So we can, if we can use our technology to improve the way we improve our politics, then maybe we end up in a better spot than we otherwise would. That's it. Read the book, My Tiny Life. Read the book, especially if you're going to go and build a virtual world. There are some other things there. Nick Key's book, The Proteus Paradox, is really interesting in studying how people work, how people behave differently and the same inside virtual worlds. That's a really good book as well. Terra Nova still exists. It's not very active anymore, but there's loads of really good stuff there. Ralph Costa has done lots of really good thinking in this area. And I also have a blog, which sometimes has stuff on it. So thanks for listening. That was a bit longer than I was hoping it would be, but hopefully we have some time for questions.
So is there a problem about things that people do in these virtual worlds leaking out into what they do in the real world that makes it a big risk in using them experimentally? So I'm thinking of, you know, other kinds of, thinking more broadly about virtual worlds, virtual communities, Facebook, like the activities that people do there can affect their actions, beliefs in the real world, so they're not as microcosmic as perhaps you might like.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's interesting looking at the magic circle, right? People who build games talk about the magic circle, and how, you know, the reason you're not allowed to put 50 extra quid down in a game of Monopoly is because when you're playing the game of Monopoly, that's supposed to be the game and you're supposed to be playing the rules. One of the things that happens, one of the interesting things that's been happening with virtual worlds is that leakage, right? One of the reasons that you can study EverQuest as a real economy is because you can figure out what the exchange rate is between EverQuest money and real money. And the reason you can do that is because people are making money in EverQuest and then selling it for real money on eBay. Because there are some people who have lots of time and there are some people who have lots of money, and there's a trade to be had between the people who want lots of virtual money and have lots of real money. So there is definitely leakage happening. And you could imagine that people taking part in an experiment to design new ways of governing the real world might leak out into the real world. That might be a bug or a feature, depending on what you think about the real world and what you think about the virtual world. But I mean, but certainly you should be careful about how those things, the boundaries between those things, and they're unlikely to be hermetically sealed, right? I mean, one of the reasons that people care about these things, right? One of the reasons that the rape in cyberspace was an actual real crime is because people identified strongly with their avatars in the virtual world and therefore did feel really hurt. And so people do invest in virtual worlds. And actually, a lot of the interesting things happen when people are so invested in a virtual world that they care about them. And it's not just bits of zeros and ones and digital toys and dollhouses and whatever, but it is actually a community that people care about. That's when interesting things happen. But also, yes, that's therefore, you know, at that point when you are deeply invested in it, then it does affect your real life in the same way that, you know, you're in multiple different communities in your real life and they affect you, and your different personas that you take on in different environments all affect you. I'm waving my hands. I'm not a social scientist, so I don't know the answers. But it's definitely interesting. It's definitely interesting. I think a lot of the things that make this interesting are the fact that that people do get invested, but because they get invested, there's leakage that happens across these boundaries. They're not completely clean.
Who's online asking questions, but definitely one. Yeah, so I think that sort of vision or proposal for virtual worlds as experiments in societies and political systems is really interesting. How do you go about it? So as you know, like academic researchers, it seems hard to create enough worlds at enough scale with enough people in them to know, or maybe you can, but is there any Metaverse provider who's going to be able to open up the gates and let people mess in quite bad ways with things as under the guise of experiments?
Right. So I think this is a really interesting question. So the way Larry Lessig has done it is by working with people who are developing virtual worlds, and that's been a valuable partnership, right? I think like his proposals to change the way that Second Life was built benefited Second Life. I think also benefited him in the sense that he learned from it. Like, okay, cool, if we build this world that sort of has intellectual property built into it at some sort of atomic level, what happens, right? I think that must be a process. That was an interesting experiment.
Surely that's a process of trying to make the right choices based upon the lessons you've learned, rather than setting up experiments.
Yeah, I think
It's not saying, hey, okay, now let's build a Second Life that's really oppressive and bad.
Yeah, and
let's see what happens.
Yeah, and falls to pieces within 6 months. Right. So
it's not quite that, is it?
No, so I think there's So I think there's an opportunity for both of those things, right? I think there's opportunity for political thinkers and social scientists, economics professors to work with people who are trying to make successful virtual worlds. But I also think there is opportunity for academic departments to go, okay, we're going to become an experimental philosophy department, and instead of building a super collider under Europe, we're going to build virtual worlds, and we're going to get people to take part in them, and we're going to find out what happens. We're going to run them at high speed. Here are our hypotheses. We're going to have an ethics committee, so that we make sure that people don't come to harm doing it. But we explain to people that that this is not a virtual world which is just for hanging out in and that will live forever, but it's a virtual world that we expect to run 10 times in a year, and then find out if we always get the same outcomes, or we get different outcomes, and so on. There is a virtual world called A Tale in the Desert, which is a commercial virtual world, which does not last forever and is really interesting because of it, right? It is a tale. And so you sign up for a telling, and you get put into the virtual world with a cohort, and the virtual world actually goes somewhere, which is interesting, right? Instead of it being like The Simpsons, where everything resets at the end of everything and we're all back to normal and then the next episode happens, there is actually a story arc, and it actually has a beginning and a middle and an end. So you can build those virtual worlds. But I agree that if you're doing radical things with the politics in the virtual world, then you probably need to find funding which is something other than you're expecting the punters to pay for their oppressive political experience. But I do think, I'd be way more excited about going to a philosophy course where part of my coursework in the first year was that I agreed to take part in these virtual world experiments that are happening, so that instead of just reading the political works that have been done, I actually get in there and play the part of somebody, or play myself in a virtual world and see what happens and learn things experimentally. And at the end of it, we just go, right, great, had enough of that oppressive state, let's try a different one.
Thank you. There are comments online as well as in the room.
Don't think so. Not obvious currently.
I don't know, maybe it's a stupid question, but how much difference now is there between a virtual world and social media?
I think they try and go after different applications, but there are definitely ones which have lots of overlap. I think in a lot of, if you're talking about a social virtual world, probably the biggest difference is that one is synchronous and one is asynchronous, and that we tend to use social media in a way where we, put our nice pictures of sunsets on Facebook one evening, so that the next morning when we're waiting for the bus, we can look at everybody else's sunsets. But whereas virtual worlds tend to be more synchronous, right, and tend to be more conversational, But I think you can have virtual worlds that are very similar in their goals as social networks. You can also have virtual worlds which are very different, where the goal is not to be you and to be play a role and to be somebody different.
That feels like the essential difference to me. When you can add some 3D graphics to a web page. Incrementally you can make it more immersive or more sense of presence, and there's not that much difference really. I mean, there's no magic to just sticking a bit of 3D. I think the fundamental difference is surely between whether it's essentially reflecting reality or reflecting some fiction. And that's really what the people who are making VR are trying to do. They're giving you more and more of this imaginary world, where social media, there's an inherent assumption, I think, that it's somehow reflecting the reality of our social lives. Maybe not everyone sees it that way, but it's the prevailing sense of it. I mean, these are stories about real people in the real world and real stuff.
Yeah.
VR is like, this is crazy shit world you can go and live your fantasies out in.
Yeah, but even the ones where you live your fantasies out, what tends to happen is that the virtual world creator will provide some amount of content, typically 6 months worth of content that they've spent 3 years building, and then everyone will join the virtual world. They'll burn through that content in 6 months, and the hope is that they've made enough friends along the way that it turns into just this like social hangout virtual chat room. At the end of it, it's just everybody's wearing helmets and has swords. But at the end of it, like often the world, the role-playing content in the world is there just to provide an icebreaker. This is just a collaborative task for us to achieve together, so that eventually we all just hang out in the virtual world, having seen it all. Because there is no way that as a virtual world developer you can add content faster than people can consume it. It just isn't possible, except if you have a user-generated world like Second Life, where everyone's making content for each other, and then hopefully there will continue to be new stuff to look at forever. But even then, you find people in Second Life will spend a bunch of time looking at all the cool stuff in Second Life, and then they'll be like, we've seen lots of cool stuff, let's just hang out. We'll go to a disco or whatever, let's just hang out. So like things end in that sort of social space. But I think the thing that I'm interested in thinking about and talking about and was proposing at the end there is that the goal is not to just give people some interesting stuff to do until it becomes a social hangout. Have the interesting stuff be the thing that you're trying to do, and then once you've figured it out, turn it off, change the parameters, fire it up again, try again. And so that would be much more about the actual simulation in the virtual world than maybe some of the things we've seen up till now.
Right. So you talked a little bit about norms and about rules and things like that for virtual worlds. I'm curious whether there's also a sort of an awareness, certainly an awareness, within your environment of people working in engineering these systems of the kind of attempts in politics now to actually put in regulation, like the online harms bill that's currently being debated, and whether you think, or you and like the people around you see it as a good thing that there is regulation being proposed and potentially coming in, or whether you see it as a bad thing.
Well, I certainly think, to slightly dodge the question, that we haven't solved the problem in the real world either.
Yeah.
And so the thing that I'm interested in here is really giving us more goes, right? Because, the risks of changing the real world are high. And if we get it wrong, we can get like bad consequences that we're stuck with. I think the nice thing about building disposable virtual worlds is that we can try stuff out, get it wrong, and then turn the thing off again. And then try again, and no one's, other than the memories that they made along the way, then hopefully nobody's worse off than they were when they started off. So yeah, I think like this is definitely a really interesting area. I don't think we've solved as a population all of the problems that have been created by the fact that we can now talk to each other much more easily than we used to be able to, right? I think we're still grappling with that as a society, but we could potentially use virtual worlds as one of the ways in which we grapple with it as a society, which potentially have fewer bad consequences than just experimenting on the one real world that we have and that we're stuck with and we can't leave. One of the best things about virtual worlds is you can just leave, turn them off, not come back if you don't want to.
Probably more or less on time. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks for listening.